really for me a very great pleasure and honor to introduce senior research scientist Karen Engelhardt from Carnegie Mellon. The title of her talk is a fascinating one. It's called The Forgiving Environment, and we've been discussing concepts of why that is called that. It's very fascinating, and you'll be delighted to hear about those concepts. The title itself represents a bridging, if you will, of the disciplines concerned with the environment and those concerned with human and psychological sciences. Indeed, Karen Engelhardt is representative in experience and expertise of the interface between human and behavioral need and the high technology of robotics, artificial intelligence, and electronic communications. Karen Engelhardt is the director of the Health and Human Services Robotics Laboratory. There's so much to say about Karen that I've got to read it. You'll have to forgive me. Some of the current projects in which she is involved include the smart home, integrating artificial intelligence and robotic systems to create a home environment for individuals with disabilities. And another project is what we're very concerned with in this college, the robotic vocational workstation, a voice-controlled robotic workstation that can be utilized by individuals with upper limb dysfunction, enabling them to perform employment-related tasks. Therefore, Karen is a major authority and consultant in biomedical robotics. She is a consultant in both human engineering and artificial intelligence, and a research health scientist. And we hope that Karen will continue to be a consultant on the work that we are proposing in our prototype housing for the elderly. Karen Engelhardt has 2 degrees with university distinction and honors from Stanford University, which, as you know, has spawned some of the leaders in the field of electronic communications. Her degrees are in human biology and physiological psychology. Her studies abroad have included in-home healthcare and consumer issues for the National Health Service of Great Britain. Her honors and awards include being a Harry S. Truman Scholar, a Stanford University Scholar, and a Hirsch Scholar. Even as an undergraduate, she was awarded a prestigious National Science Foundation grant. Her list of publications and conference presentations is a formidable one. I've counted, and probably I haven't got them all in, over 120 significant publications, and there are many in the pipeline. We have to thank, incidentally, Jim Oleksak from the National Center for Senior Living at South Bend for introducing Karen Engelhardt to this university. As you probably realize, Karen is in very great demand by universities, corporations, and associations. We are very lucky to have her visit, and in fact, she's sandwiching this visit in between going to Japan next week, or very shortly. Enough said. Please join with me in welcoming Karen Engelhardt. You can see this is where we have this one. I've got it the wrong way around.
If I survive this.
I told her that if we don't like the lecture, we're going to pull the cord. Well, I don't think that will come to it. There we go.
Thank you. Thank you, Stan, for that wonderful introduction. I'm very pleased to be here today. It's been a wonderful experience already. I've gotten to have a tour of your marvelous campus and meet with some of the people that you're lucky enough to have teaching you and have be colleagues with you. So thank you for inviting me here. I hope by the time you leave today that you know more than probably 0.5% of all the people in the nation know about robotics, and in particular the area we're going to be talking about. Let me give you a thumbnail sketch of kind of what you're going to see and hear, and first warn you that I've often been quoted as speaking faster than the speed of sound. If I'm doing that to you, please wave me down. I'm also very interactive. If there's anything you want to know, I love to share what knowledge I have with you. Please don't be embarrassed or afraid, to raise your hand and stop me. So this is who we are, the Health and Human Services Robotics Laboratory at Carnegie Mellon. It is the only laboratory like it in the world that is dedicated to using robotic and artificial intelligence technologies exclusively in health and human services. And I'm going to define for you today some new ideas in robotics, and we're going to just very simply talk about robots as being machines that sense, think, and act. And as we go along, we will define that more fully and hopefully more understandably for you. But I want to add a caveat to that for you because the area that I've been working in for the last 8 years also demands that they are useful tools to serve humans, not to replace humans, to serve humans. And this is a very critical issue in terms of the way we begin to look at robotic technology as we begin to try to move it into the area of serving human beings. Now, if Stan had been kind enough to have invited me here about 6 months ago, you would not have seen this slide. You would have seen a slide that had only industrial and personal robots with an arrows leading up to service robots. I used to say that the industrial folks, and you all know who these guys tend to be and what kind of technology they make. It's the arm technology. You've seen them spraying cars and moving pallets. So that's generally who I'm referring to in terms of industrial robotics. They came along in about the 60s, and what they did is they put together machines or tools that do jobs very well indeed, do them repeatably, do them reliably, but generally one job at a time. The personal robot people came along in about 1984, and they had exactly the opposite end of the scale. They wanted a robot to walk and talk and sing and dance, and we have personal robots that do that, but they don't do it very well. So what we're trying to do is work somewhere in the middle. We need this robustness that we're finding in the industrial robot world. We're needing the whimsy, if you will, and oftentimes the serendipity, and oftentimes what I call robotality that you'll find in the personal robot world. One example of this might be, let's think about personal robots and how we would incorporate robotality. If we were developing a robotic system that would help deliver range of motion exercise to a child who had been burned, you really would not want a system that looked like a robot. You would want a system that acted lovingly toward that child and encouraged them in a way that was meaningful to the child. So that's what we're talking about robotality. But you would certainly also want that precision and that reliability that we see in the industrial robots today. What we're really talking about, or the way I like to refer to it, is smart technology. Now, we can talk a little more about that. There are a lot of philosophical issues that have to do with why we don't always talk about robots thinking, and those are a subject of many lectures, I'm sure, for you. But generally, we want to concentrate more on where we might begin to utilize the kinds of technologies that we're looking at. And our research has concentrated in some of these areas. I'm going to be briefly walking you through some of that research today. Now, why would we begin to be talking about utilizing robots in healthcare and in human services to serve humans? Well, the 4 basic reasons that I'm doing the work I do have to do with these sorts of things. Particularly when we're working with disabled people, people with disabilities, or older people, we want to seriously talk about how we can increase that independence. We want to talk about either delaying or doing away with institutionalization that is unnecessary for humans. So we really want to talk about smart homes in a way, for instance, that can help keep older people out of nursing homes, where we can really begin to talk about using smart technology to help boost some of the functional losses that we're seeing as humans. You're going to be seeing a robot that has gone to work in a kitchen environment, in a hospital kitchen, and in this area we really want to talk about increasing quality of care. I'll tell you more about how we can do that. We want to talk about increased productivity. In the United States, I don't have to tell you the kinds of races we're beginning to run with the rest of the world. And indeed, we want to talk about increased job satisfaction. Now, that may seem a little dichotomous to you if you're used to thinking about the industrial robots, but if you begin to think about taking portions of tasks, I didn't say take away jobs, take away portions of tasks that are either dangerous, odious, boring, repetitious, or unwanted, we've got a list of adjectives, then you might begin to understand why people would want to utilize robots in a portion of a task. Also, some of the conceptualizations that we've been trying to develop at Carnegie Mellon have to do with research and development. Much research stays in university laboratories because we do not take a life cycle approach to our conceptualization of ideas and trying to follow those ideas through to the dissemination phase. So we try to talk about more than just R&D. But I think the reason I'm invited here today at all has to do with this. This is the center and focus of our work. Robots are not my primary work. People are my primary work. I use robots to try to begin to think how I can help people. And to that end, in the early 80s when I was with it at Stanford, we began to work on this kind of a conceptualization. It's called interactive evaluation. It is a process. Everything I'm going to be showing you today has been included under this kind of a paradigm to where we can talk about simultaneously looking at human issues and looking at machine issues. We cannot divorce the two. As we move further and further along the track of smarter and smarter technology, we really must merge both the technical and the human aspects of the kinds of technology we're working with. And this really is going to lead to very interesting considerations for us. We will know more about the desirable characteristics of both the human and the machines we're working with. And as I talk with you today, I want to try to get you to really expand your conceptual basis of some of these kinds of ideas and begin to really think about the need-based development that has not occurred in the past in this country. These are the sorts of folks I work with every day of the week. It takes this kind of a thinking group to be able to really talk about the kinds of technologies we're talking about. No one of us certainly has the answers or all of the answers to the questions that need to be asked in this area. This is in my laboratory. This is the robotic vocational workstation that I'm going to be showing you a little video on later. This is an all voice controlled robot, and this is the team. I want you to notice two things. Not only is it a multidisciplinary team with both technical and clinical skills, but it's also an intergenerational team. I talk about my wizards and my wisdoms, and it really is just that. We're talking about utilizing some of the marvelous, wonderful gifts of the young people and blending those with some of the wisdom of the older people who actually have been the people who have led us into the atom and into space. I always like to remind the younger people that unfortunately John Glenn is a senior citizen right now. So the process of going to space was one that was started many, many years before we did have our young computer wizards. So we do look at, as I said, the whole process. That's what we're going to be talking about. And I urge you, if you haven't read Jim Adams' book on conceptual blockbusting, it might be one you want to get and read some weekend when you, of course, have nothing else to do with your studies. What we're going to be talking about a little bit for the next 5-10 minutes or so is trying to dispel the myth for you. I want to give you some of my bird's eye view of some of the robots I've worked with, to also give you a little more conceptualization of the kind of forms that I'm beginning to think about or we're beginning to see in terms of the technologies. And Bruce, this is particularly for you so that we can make sure we have a sourced piece of information here so that you can begin to understand where some of the kinds of technologies are. Now, I was just at a conference last week in Kentucky, and Japan, I believe at that point, was at 90K, and I believe the United States at that time was reported at 40K. So take these. I always also like to explain to you, these figures are very soft figures. The Japanese define robots in quite a different way than what we have traditionally defined robotics. So this is just by way of giving you some kind of a feeling. Also, I'd like to give you a tiny little quick run thumbnail sketch, if you will, of where we kind of, how we started with some of this kind of technology. And I think if we trace some of our roots, we go all the way back to the early mechanisms of the clocks. We move up into the 50s and 60s when probably some of the most important discoveries in solid state technologies came about. You'll notice that robots are early to us. Only in the 60s and 70s did we really begin to apply and use industrial robotics. Personal robots that I mentioned to you earlier came in the mid-80s, and service robots, as we're going to be talking about them and defining them today, was just recognized by the Robotics Industries Association in 1986. I might mention to you, I've just recently been elected the president of the National Service Robot Association, so this is great fun for me. This is sometimes our conceptualization based on media coverage of what is true and not true, this all-knowing, all-thinking, wonderful robot that trips around our house and scrubs our floors and does our windows. Or indeed, we may think about these characters who we all know and love out of some of our most famous media recently, and begin to think about them as very human-like. Well, in actuality, these are the kinds of things we're dealing more with, the kinds of inventions, if you will, that we're really having to look at a little more seriously. This is the RB5X, if not the first, at least among the first two personal robots to come on the market. This is some of the early work we did in the early 80s, taking it into nursing facilities, working with older people. This was just recently shown at Robot 12, and it is an attempt for an automatic vacuum cleaner and floor cleaner and sweeper. There are 3 of these right now in active development within companies. A smart vacuum, if you will. There's a second one. One is coming out of France. This is probably the first, what I consider a legitimate healthcare robot. And by the way, it was one of the fastest selling robots in the United States last year, or last couple of years. And this is a laboratory robot. If you begin to think about in healthcare our worries now with handling body fluids and some of the sort of tasks that are dangerous, remember some of our adjectives we use, dangerous, odious, boring, etc. You might begin to imagine that a robotic device that would take over some of the handling of the bodily fluids that might be contagious to humans could indeed reduce some of the dangers affiliated or associated with that job. Now this too is a personal robot. It's being developed by a company in California. It's being funded a great deal, of course, by our Defense Department because it can indeed work as a stealth robot, kind of tiptoeing through rough terrain and alternative terrain, if you will. But then again, you might imagine this same kind of arachnid shape carrying a disabled person in a wheelchair and being able to traverse steps and small stairs. Now, this little robot was called RoPet, and I like to leave this, this slide in here because this was my mother. I spent 3 years working very hard to try to keep Mother out of an institution before she died last year. And she was very instrumental in not only the directionality of my life in robots, but helping me to evaluate them. This little robot would go into a room and map the room. It found the door. It had motion detectors and voice input and output. She could program the voice to only know her voice and also passwords, so she had great fun with this every night. And it would station itself in front of the door, and if it detected a motion, it also had some infrared sensing on it, it would say who goes there, and if no one answered, or if they took too long to answer, they had a delay set in it, or took too long to answer, or answered in the wrong voice, it would sound off this unbelievable high decibel car alarm. Now, it was a nice quasi-toy, if you will, but indeed it served some more interesting purposes for Mother. In California, we could not have pets in apartments, so she had this sense of security. Whether indeed it provided any security or not might be arguable. But this kind of devices that we're talking about, beginning to build forgiving environments, the same thing Stan had mentioned earlier, Stan, when you talked about a device that would know her and talk to her and ask her was everything okay. And then if everything wasn't okay, electronically seize the phone line, of course, and be able to summons emergency help, just like we have with the personal help button at this moment in history. We could also attach a mercury switch to her that if she were in a prone position, the robot would pick that up and know it and alert someone that she had fallen. Number of ways of doing it. You can make smart floors so that you have sensors in the floors so that if someone is taking up more space than footprint space, then it would alert a system. These were at the Robot 12 conference, and again, I show this to you because in Palo Alto we did do some work with programming robots to ballet because I was very interested in looking at user acceptance and trying to understand if we could build more human-like motions into a robot, if they would be less frightening and more acceptable for people to work with. Now, these are industrial robots, and at the last show, they called them the kissing robots, and they indeed were doing what looked to me very much like a ballet, although I'm not sure it was the proper notation. This, I mentioned to you earlier our dream of window cleaning robots, and that's indeed what this is, the little silver box going in a vertical direction there. There's a couple of 3 of these coming out in prototypic stages. One is called Luke Skywasher. I think that's interesting. anyway, this is more typical of, again, what you're going to see in industrial robots. This many shapes, many forms, but again, pretty much an arm, path programming to do certain tasks. This is Hero. Again, this little guy falls somewhere between a personal robot and a service robot. There's a research project at Rice University, Dr. Cheatham right now, in which he's utilizing the robot, this Hero robot, to be an assistive device to people in wheelchairs. This may or may not look like a robot to you, and this is at one of Carnegie Mellon's own. It's called NavLab. I understand that it was taken off campus at one time, driverless, and the students got themselves into a heap of trouble taking it to a gas station to ask for gasoline. This is some of the inside of it. You may wonder why it would be important to us that we're looking at NavLab. First of all, part of that technology is going to be used in Moon Rover, which is going to be a project at Carnegie Mellon. And also, you may begin to think about our own safety as drivers, particularly the elderly, particularly people with disabilities who may not see as well, who may not be able to turn their head as well, who may not have as reflexes as well as we would like to see. If someone could warn us not to pull out into that lane when our blind spot has failed us, we really don't know how many lives we might save a year. So what I've tried to show you in a very rapid fashion is, and again you have to kind of bear with me, this human biology background, is what I call my gene pool of robot characteristics. That is, we have taken portions of what I consider robot evolution, that we see different forms and different functions for robots. And there is a decided what I call sensor gene pool, again, too. And we, a few months ago, or actually a couple years ago, I guess, sat around the laboratory one day and we began talking about, well, how many systems could we create, and we began talking about the kinds of sensory capabilities that exist at this moment in history. And these are the kinds of things that exist now to be utilized in systems. And if we do the permutations on these are the kinds of possibilities for devices in smart systems that we're talking about. If we integrate the sensory capabilities of robots with the sensory capabilities of humans, these are the numbers that we're beginning to look at. So it's rather awesome in terms of thinking about what we could do with this technology. And I like to give you a little overview of some of the overview areas that we look at in robots and humans. Those of you who may have a biological or a sociological background certainly know, well, I don't know if you understand, but you know about perception. And you know that it is something that we have always kind of considered uniquely human. This is certainly something now we're building into robots. They have to be able to not only analyze an image or take in an image, if you will, they have to be able to have a perception about that image in order to make a decision about what to do with the image that they're needing to understand. Manipulation is certainly we know about kinematics, we know about dynamics. And manipulation in robots and humans are both critical issues. I work every day with people who are paralyzed from the neck down, and manipulation to them is probably more important or as important as mobility is to them. And mobility is certainly an area. And cognition, again, as I mentioned to you, it's an area we've always kind of thought of as being somewhat uniquely human, and yet this is indeed an area that we're beginning to try to understand and even teach about in terms of robotics. Other areas have to do with control. Control for humans is a very important issue. Sociologically, physiologically, psychologically, control is critical. Controlling our own world, controlling our sense of control. Centers of control is an important issue. We do 3 kinds of research in our laboratory, and I want to give you a tiny flavor of each one of them. Basic, baseline, and applied. The basic has more to do with the human needs and attitudinal assessments from the human perspective. Human system integration is something I'm going to talk to you a little bit more at length. It's a neologism that we've termed or coined, and I think it has a lot of validity. And I think some of the most exciting areas and most important areas, and one of the reasons you're here is to hear about some of our applied work, and I certainly find it one of our most exciting areas. In the area of basic research, we look at need not only from the individual's perspective, but in this instance, for instance, if the individual had a disability and say it's dressing and they were paralyzed or partially paralyzed and they could do a portion of the task, We want to know from them what it would take to get the task accomplished 100%. To that end, we have to look at the shortfall, and that's what we try to map on to the robotic technologies that are existing or that can be built. We began working in the early 80s in 4 areas: activities of daily living, vocational, recreation, and therapeutic. I'm not going to show you pictures of the people painting by voice, although a portion of the clip from the National Geographic has that on there, using voice-controlled robot for a person with high-level paralysis to use it to paint. We had it performing board games for the individuals, anything to allow them to recreate or recreate, just as you and I do when they can't utilize their hands. What we are continuing along with are certainly the activities of daily living and vocational and therapeutic tasks. Need from the caregiver's perspective, I'm going to mention to you briefly some work we're doing with the state of Pennsylvania on looking at burdening of the caregiver and how technology might intervene to relieve some of that burdening. Here are our adjectives, as I mentioned to you earlier, that we use in our research to try to better understand where some of these shortfalls exist. Our task profile, when we go in to do our human factors research, we never look just at robots and we never look just at humans. It's absolutely critical that they function within an environment. Those of you who are architecture students, I don't have to tell you this, but if you were engineering students, I would have to tell you this, because you wouldn't be told this probably in your classes. Need from the administrator's perspective, this is important to be able to cost justify the robots, to be able to justify to their boards, to be able to talk about why this technology is important. So it's very important for us as we do our research to be able to justify the kinds of systems that we're developing. And certainly need from society's perspective in terms of increased productivity. I also like to talk very seriously about rehabilitation potential, not only for people with young people with disabilities, but just as importantly for older people who we've generally talked about custodial coping for. And I think it's really incumbent on us to begin, because we are they in a few years, it's really incumbent on us to begin to think very seriously about how we use this technology. In 1984, we took robots for the first time into nursing homes. This was in California. We identified 54 different areas that robots might be used in and reduced them down to 12 different areas. There is work going on actively within companies in probably half of these areas now. And in 1984, there was not work going on in any of them that we knew of. So it's pretty exciting to watch this evolution. Fetch and carry, I'm going to be talking with you a little bit about that. Cognitive rehabilitation, I'm working with the Veterans Administration right now on a memory aid device that can be used by amnestic patients. It will have voice output, so that there is some work going on there, and I think other work around the United States is beginning to look at the use of robots in that area too. As a matter of fact, there's some work going on in Michigan with Bob Erlandson. The informed monitoring and alerting is a system that we had started working on a couple of 3 years ago. Essentially what it is the ability to utilize a knowledge base of a medical staff, to take that knowledge base and build it into a vision system, to use that vision system in a blind way to monitor for potentially dangerous behaviors of people in rooms. This is kind of the diagram of knowledge engineering and how we would go about looking at it. Ideally, it would have a vocabulary. For instance, if Ms. Jones had hypotension and she was getting ready to rise up in the bed, the vision system would be alert to that. It would warn her, Mrs. Jones, please get up carefully. It could also at the same time alert her caregiver that she was getting out of bed without proper care for her own safety. Another program, just to let you know, we work at all ends of the life spectrum here. This summer we did some work with developmental advances in health science and technology. I think we've probably at this point, our youngest child that had ever been trained on a voice-controlled robot was 5, and I think we trained him in 1984. And this year we trained a 3.5-year-old on the voice-controlled robot. Now again, this is very important if we begin talking about children that are paralyzed and beginning to use this technology. They need to be able to use it at younger and younger ages in order to be able to even take the robots to school with them to perform some of their manipulative capabilities, if you will. This is one of the children that we had. He had cerebral palsy. However, he told everybody it was an old football injury. And these are some of the robots they worked with. And these are some of the things that they learned during the work year. As a matter of fact, you'd be amazed at how accurate these children are at encoding these kinds of words and understanding them. And these were some of the concepts they learned about encoders, they learned about motors, they learned about end effectors, they learned about grippers, they learned how to use robots, they built robots, they learned about distancing, and we used the robot and the sonar to try to teach them about sonar waves and the time lags. So we were beginning to try to work toward both math and biology, beginning to use robotic technology in both teaching of both math and biology. Some of our baseline research has to do with understanding attitudes better, and this was some work we did for the American Association of Retired Persons. We had about 400 people in the study, and we were looking at attitudes toward advanced technologies. Now, again, I'm not going into any of these in detail. There are papers on all of these that have been published. If you have any interest in them, catch me after or catch Stan, and I'll be glad to get it to you. I'm just trying to give you a sense of what you would do with service robots and how one might go about looking at them. These were the 4 areas we looked at for the AARP. Voice technology, again, is some of the baseline research. Voice technology is very important to us. We've been working it since the early 80s. The 4 areas that we really like to work in are reminding, alerting, informing, and directing. And we try to move, again, a new conceptualization, if you will. You've heard a lot about man-machine interface. I'd like for you to try to drop that out of your vocabulary, if you could, and begin to think very seriously about human-system integration, because that is indeed what we're talking about. We're talking about a very, very intelligent human and very, very smart systems, and how you go about integrating those two, not just interfacing them. And we need to know from that end, one of some of the areas we might ask about integration, we need to know from the point of view of voice technology how the device is going to communicate with the person and how the person is going to comprehend it. If a person has a hearing loss, a high frequency hearing loss, and you've got a system that's speaking to them in high frequency, you've got a very serious problem from the onset. If you've got a system that's speaking too rapidly, if you've got one that's using the wrong syntax, using the wrong meanings to the words, you've got problems with comprehension from the point of view of the individual using the system. Some of our mobile language research, which is just going to be published in the Journal of Human-Computer Interaction, has to do with mobile language. Again, a way of trying to talk about how we develop meta-language for robot control, particularly in home, I would like to talk about, or within a confined space. And we started by turning our laboratory into a maze. We continue with some of this work, by the way, with some of the newer mobile robots we have. We tried to classify by function as we had people walk robots or themselves through the different mazes. We tried to classify by functions the kinds of directional commands that were being given. And we tried just to look at some of the natural commands. And this hadn't been done before. You might begin to wonder why we would start doing this. If I'm building a smart robot and I want to limit my vocabulary to an understandable amount of words, both for the human and the robot, it's very important to know what it is the robot needs to know. And the most important way to find out what the robot needs to know is to go to the people who are going to be talking to the robot. So it's very straightforward, although when we first started doing this kind of research, we really couldn't find any information. So in our first 6 pilot subjects, we found 23 ways to say right. Now you might begin to understand the kind of knowledge assimilation that is going to have to take place before we really have voice control that's going to be able to be on command. Is that the video? Sorry, that was a bad break. I've got 2 more slides before we break for a video. There's absolutely no way I can stand here and tell you about robots without showing you in some kind of a 3-dimensional way what I mean. So after these next 2 slides, what's going to happen is I'm going to show you 2 videos. One is called Discover the World of Science, which was produced in 1983, and a National Geographic special, which did special on our work, and it's called Miraculous Machines. Again, these were some of the results of mobile language. We need to really be direct, short, linguistically clear action sentences. And again, I think I'm going to hold off on this, Roger, on adult learning, and go ahead and put this tape in. Now, I'm going to walk over here and hope that I manage to make it. Is Discover in? It's in it. Do I have the lights? I'm not sure I can handle them, but do I have the lights? Can y'all see that okay? Now, on the National Geographic special, the woman, the 87-year-old woman using this robot for the first time, is a long-term patient in the nursing home, but she did not know she wasn't going home. She's also very hard of hearing, as is the robot. Okay. Now you've seen an example of both industrial and personal robots being used in a service robot mode, if you will. We've trained over 200 people on voice-controlled robots, and we've always utilized this kind of a learning principle base, if you will. It's Malcolm Knowles, and it's talked about adult learning theory. It's called andragogy. Again, there are papers on this. It has to do with self-directedness and a kind of a different way of teaching that's quite different from pedagogy. It's interesting that we have noted that we've been able to train children utilizing these principles as well as adults, so it might behoove us to look at them a little more carefully. Again, it's part of what I like to talk about. It's part of what I'm involved in, certainly from a personal perspective, and it has to do with lifelong learning and the way we go about accomplishing that, the way we take seriously developing principles to allow us to do it. Probably one of our most important area of baseline research has to do with safety. And again, particularly when we're working in the healthcare environment, we always have to look at the trade-off between benefit and risk. This is true of any kind of medical device that's being utilized. We also have to very clearly look at safety, both, I call it the HER model, human, environment, and robot, in that order, by the way, human first, environment second. And we try to look at each of these components as factors within the overall safety system. It's not up to us just to talk about safety for the robot or safety for the person, or do we train them, or how do we train them. But we really need to start developing a conceptualization of functionally inherently safe systems. And this really does have to do, and I'm not going to talk a lot about it today, but it does have to do with how we design both the architecture, the software of these systems, as well as the hardware and how we integrate them into the environment. We also have to look at speed. We've done some interesting research on this, both from the point of view of older people kind of shuffling along in nursing homes to code blues in acute care situations where a robot's going to have to get out of the way where an emergency team goes skidding down the hall. And those are going to be very important. The speed that we have seen the industrial folks need in order to compete is not going to be useful in our world. As a matter of fact, the more thoughtful the robot is, the better. We're going to have to teach the robot to know and respond more to humans. We cannot have robots roaming around that do not know and understand humans, that do not know and understand living creatures, and what they should do in case they encounter one. We also try to look at the medical regulations and safety that go with trying to talk about transferring these kinds of technologies into medical environments. And we also, I've done a number of papers on this for the engineering societies. Too often we talk about technology's failure, and we do not look at human error. In the last 10 years, there have been 10 robot deaths in Japan. A very careful analysis of those, that's about 1 per year, by the way, which is a pretty safe technology. 1 per year, and in close, careful analysis of the situation, in every case, it was human error. That humans had transcended safety limits, that they had crawled under safety wires, they had not followed the regulations or the training of working properly with the robot. So these are very important issues in terms of the human system integration issues. Now the applied research is really more oriented toward systems, toward development of the actual form and the robots that we're using. This is some research we did with Transitions Research Corporation. I'm going to use them in particular because they're getting most of the press lately, including things like Fortune magazine. So we're going to use them as one example of some of the technology that we've worked on. Transitions Research Corporation is a company that was started by a man who is called the father of robotics. And he had been in industrial robots for many years and got out, sold his interests and got out for a number of years. Then decided that this was a very futile area, this area of service robots. So within the last couple of years, he's come back into the marketplace. And he wanted to know, what do we do? Where do we start? Should it look like? What should it do? And those sorts of things. So we began with fetch and carry tasks. Remember 1984 research identifying the 12 different areas. We began with fetch and carry research. We looked at some of these different areas for them. We identified, we went into more depth now, beginning to look at fetch and carry tasks, just branching, if you will, for those of you who are doing trees. You branch now into what we do with fetch and carry. From there, we can look at the specific people that are using fetch and carry tasks within the hospital or within, in this case, these were 4 different settings, rehab as well as acute care hospital. And these were kind of some of the numbers that we came up with. Again, we looked at time savings, and this was from the nursing and nursing assistant staff. They felt like in hospitals that they could save up to 4 hours per shift a week, from 0 up to 4 hours a week. It's very interesting. We've got many hundreds of responses on these questionnaires where we begin to ask about job satisfaction. There's been serious issues in this. Of course, if you have to deal with human employment, these are important questions to ask in terms of the way they're going to deal with the robots. We have overwhelmingly had positive responses across the board in this area. Again, I don't know if there's a bias from the way we present the technology too, that could be part of it. We try to do pre and posts and all the sorts of things that one does to try to rule those out. This was the second generation Helpmate. By the way, that was also a name I helped to choose. I think it was a nice one. It's called Helpmate. This is the second generation of it. This is the one that appeared in Newsweek, and you'll notice that it's now moved from being just a robot looking like it might work by itself to a robot assistant working with a nurse, which is a booth. And this was its most recent form at Robot 12 this summer. I don't think this will be its final form at all. I think that you'll see it a couple of 3 more iterations before that's finished. There's a great deal of research on that. I think it was a 20-page report that went in. I'm going to switch gears now and talk about some work going on in our lab, which we call our MIC project, which is the Multifunctional Intelligent Kitchen Environment. We did this in our first iteration. We did it with Beaver Medical Center. We were looking at silverware handling within a medical center. This was the director. I want you to notice again, I don't have a lot of time to talk with you about our process of working with people. It's not just on paper. We do it on a one-to-one basis. Everybody we work with has come in and trained on these robots so that they really know and understand the systems as well as we know and understand them. This is Ruth Southern. She was just ready to retire. And again, I want to say to you that these lifetime vocational pursuits are incredibly important to everyone. Ruth was very excited about this new area. As a matter of fact, she's continuing as a consultant to a robot company even after retirement in the food service domain. Let me just go ahead and walk across that. This is the system. We're going to show you a very short video clip. This is the day it went into Beaver County for its first little test drive, if you will, and we'll show you a small video clip of this. Again, we identified the fact that 5 different people were handling the technology in a healthcare. Again, now, notice that these were different robot systems, these, all different kind of configurations. I also wonder if you caught the fact that in the early film I showed you that our work from 1984, the person was having to use Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and some of those sorts of commands, remember? And we've moved now, the technology is such that he was saying, get Lotus, get me a drink, what we call natural language commands. Okay, and this is the newest robot that we're going to be incorporating into the next generation workstation. Now, we're going to really launch in for the next 5 minutes or so to the house that we want to talk about, the forgiving environment that we've talked a little bit about vocationally creating environments, and we've talked about the kinds of configurations that you might see. But from that great tome, McCall's of February 1956, I want to bring back to your memory what was at that time considered a fantasy home. automation in the home in 1956. And these were the kinds of things they were hoping to see in terms of fantasy automation. Now, I bring this to you to let you know and understand how quickly and how far we have come without our even realizing what was going on. I also want to know if anyone has ever seen electric sheets, because to my knowledge, that's probably about the only thing on these lists that have not come to fruition and indeed productization. But again, just by letting us remind ourselves that some of the pie in the sky stuff that we may have thought 20, 30 years ago just was not possible, or certainly not for a long time, it is happening. And if we look at 1958, remember that was 56, and if we look at 1958, that was our very first integrated circuit, and I want you to look what's happened in 1988. So we're beginning to talk about now the use of smarter and smarter capabilities. We're beginning to talk about the fact that we can move these kinds of technologies into the home if indeed they're not already. As a matter of fact, I would hypothesize to you that based upon the sense, think, and act definition I've given you for robots, I would bet that over half of you at least have a robot in your home already. Can anyone guess what it might be?